Hello, and welcome to the first ever episode of Are They Real? I'm your host, Joe Baker, and I'd like to start off with a little quote from Arthur C. Clarke, who once said, "There are two possibilities, either we're alone in the universe, or we're not. Both are equally terrifying." So, I decided to start a podcast on alien abductions, UFOs, because like so many other people, I think it's such an interesting subject, and I really wanted to be able to interact with people, and I'm hoping that once I've started doing a few of these and more people start listening, that you will email me in with some of your experiences so that I can read out and share with everyone else. So this is pretty much what I'm doing now. I'm going to be talking about a book which I read, which really got me into this subject, called The Incident at Devil's Den, which is by the author Terry Lovlace, who says it's his true story. It's very compelling. Terry himself, the author, he was the Assistant Attorney General. He was in the military. He's a solicitor. So he's a very credible person. The story reads it's just incredible, from early abductions early on in his life, following through right the way through to his later years. Terry's in his 60s now, and the events happened to him over 40 years ago, but have been a continuing thing from his young childhood, So I thought I'd really want to get stuck into that, because this was the book that really got me personally interested in the subject. I've been interested in it for a while, but this book just really sort of got me there. I actually reached out to Terry on Facebook Messenger just to sort of ask, is it actually true? And he assures me it is. He's just written a follow-up book as well, so I've downloaded that and I'm starting to work my way through that at the moment. So I'm looking forward to actually getting you guys involved in that as well. So just a quick overview. The Incident at Devil's Den is, as I mentioned, it's the true story of Terry Lovlace. And his story basically starts with him saying about why he decided to write this book 40 years on after the experience he actually had. And as some of you know who are actually keen on this subject, there's a lot that goes on with memory loss, or screened memories, or memories which have been deliberately hidden or removed from abductees. And this was a kind of a similar sort of thing for him. It was something that he'd put to bed and didn't really want to revisit ever again. But as it turns out, Terry had decided that he wanted to start jogging, start running for health, and as he got better and better and going further and further, whenever he'd get to a sort of 2-mile stretch, he'd start to get like a numbness or a tingling in his knee, and it was like clockwork. Every time he reached that 2-mile point, he'd get a numbness just above his knee. It didn't really bother him, so he never really got it checked out. So Terry'd been running for a number of years, and then in 2012 he woke up one morning and he was in absolute agony with his leg. He couldn't really move it. He was in so much pain he could barely stand up. So they decided that they were going to go to visit the emergency room with his wife. So although there was like a 3-hour wait, because obviously heart attacks and all that, they're going to take precedent over someone who's just injured their knee, they waited. Eventually they got taken in, and although his leg wasn't broken, he was still recommended to have an x-ray. So they took a couple of x-rays, then they took a couple more, and then they took some more. They took 8 x-rays in total, and it was puzzling. So there was a couple of the colleagues came in, then a few more, and they were looking over the x-rays, and then the radiologist came down and he was looking and he said, "This is really odd." And he said, I can't find it. Terry said, "Well, what can't you find?" He said, "I can't find a point of entry." He said, "On the x-ray, it looks like you've got a small piece of metal, perfect square, about the size of a thumbnail, above your kneecap. But there's no scar, there's no point of entry." So he said, "Well, I tell you what I'll do, I'll check with a UV light, because UV light fluoresces scars." So he got the UV light on there, and him and his colleagues checked. No scars. They couldn't figure out for the life of them how it actually got in there. they said, did you have any shrapnel injuries during the war when you were out serving? And he said no. And they said, maybe were you in a car accident when you were younger? And he said, no car accident. Aside from waking up this morning in all the pain that he's in with his leg, he said he'd never really injured his leg. There was nothing wrong with it. He hadn't pieced two and two together that the numb pain from where he was running was exactly where this piece of metal was found in his leg. So it was a bit of a mystery. The radiologist proceeded to tell Terry that he'd been a radiologist for 23 years and he'd never seen anything quite like this. He said it definitely wasn't from an accident, even though they tried to ask to rule that out. He said, because it's got symmetry. He said, this is definitely man-made. It's a square. And the oddities just don't stop there either. If we look at a side-on x-ray of your leg, you can see that there's an odd cluster in like a flower petal shape of little round discs of what looks like bone. I asked what's so unusual about finding bone like that in my knee, and he said, well, it's not in your knee. He said, that's in the middle of your calf, on the back of it. He said, it's not any kind of cyst I've ever seen. Cysts are round. These are perfectly little round discs. So as it turns out, we just don't know what that is, but the problem that's caused with your knee isn't actually either of those. It's that you have a Baker's cyst on your knee, which, given itself, will actually heal within a couple of weeks. There's no treatment for them. They're always benign, but you're just left with a bit of a mystery with what these other things are. But other than that, the problem with your knee will rectify itself within a couple of weeks. So Terry took himself home, but obviously this started playing on his mind as it would. He put two and two together and realised that this piece of metal was sat on that numb spot that he gets when he goes running. So he started to become somewhat obsessed with it, decided to ask for copies of the x-rays so that he could have a look at them. And he said it took a number of weeks, but eventually when the digital copies did turn up, out of the 8 pictures, there was only 2 pictures, and they said the other 6 had actually been discarded due to lack of quality. Terry examined those 2 for about half an hour, looking closely, then decided to go online to pull up the rest of his records so he could read the reports. Now, he mentions this because it's important to know in this part of the story that you can do this quite freely, because this becomes relevant later on. But when he read through the reports, the doctor's report was there, which was fine, but the radiologist's report didn't mention anything at all about the metal object under his knee. What it mentioned was the round disc object, and I quote here, he says that the radiologist called them round artifacts, rule out Baker's cysts, which is obviously very suspicious. So Terry went online to continue to have a look around to see if he could find any pictures to match what he had, and he said there was literally nothing there. The only thing that he could find on the internet that even resembled remotely what he had in his leg was alleged alien implants. He emphasises alleged. So after looking into this a bit further, what Terry discovered was one of the hallmarks of an alleged alien implant is a foreign object buried in the skin with no point of entry, no scar tissue, and no markings. So naturally, at this point, Terry decided that he wanted these out of his leg. So he decided to speak to some surgeons to get them removed, but all the surgeons declined to operate, saying that the risk of the surgery outweighed the need for it, saying that they weren't causing him any harm, it wasn't causing any danger, and to actually operate could, it would be a very bad idea. So Terry just had to basically live with them. He couldn't honestly say that they were causing him any pain, so he left them there and started referring to them collectively as it or they. But the side effect of all this was, because he'd researched it and looked into it and it was on his mind, it started dredging up memories from the past. Memories that he really didn't want to revisit or really didn't want to remember. As I said earlier, he wanted to shut the book on these and never revisit them again. And so often, what you find is that when people go through such a traumatic experience like what Terry's been through, they do what they can. Their brain just shuts it down. They don't want to remember it, and the thought of bringing all that back up, it's just absolutely horrifying. So this, I should imagine, would have been quite traumatic for him to start putting down on paper all over again and sharing. He said that after 8 weeks from going to see the radiologist, the nightmares returned, and he started suffering horrific nightmares like he used to when he was younger. These nightmares, which started plaguing him after the incident in 1977, which was the Devil's Den incident, which the book is named after. It was just haunting. It was playing on his mind something awful. He was plagued by nightmares, and his wife said, why don't you try keeping a journal, write down everything, that way, hopefully you'll stop replaying it over and over and over in your mind. So this is what he did. Every night when he'd have these horrific nightmares, his wife would support him. He'd write down the horrific nightmares that he'd have, and eventually he filled up a whole notebook. By 1979, it was chocker. So he had around 10 years of peace. After that, it seemed to work, and then there was another incident in 1987 where the journals were brought back out again for him to start using, and then they went back again after that, and then he hadn't written in them for 40 years. And now all of a sudden this had set all that back in motion again. So he decided it was probably time to revisit those notebooks, as much as he didn't want to, because that was the therapy that worked for getting rid of those memories last time, was to be able to jot all that down to stop him from playing it over and over in his mind. So Sheila, Terry's wife, decided to fly to Michigan to go into their storage locker to dig out the diaries from 1977 through to 79, and she found them all, and she brought them back, and it had, all the nightmares that he'd written down, all the drawings that he'd drawn. The last journal entry that was on there was for the second event, which was in 1987. Now Terry he wouldn't look back past that. He was afraid because of all the memories and nightmares it would drag back up. But he said, regardless of that, they all happened anyway. The nightmares were just coming back full pelt. So this carried on and on and on. And around a year after him going to see about his knee with the radiologist, he decided to go back online to look at the report again. And what he'd found was his radiologist report wasn't there anymore. It had been replaced by another one, and all it mentioned on there was about the Baker's cyst. Both reports for his knee and for his calf were just missing. They just simply weren't there anymore, and there wasn't even a notification to show that it had been replaced, which apparently is what they're supposed to do. If a report's been changed or replaced, then it's supposed to show, but there was literally nothing to show that there was even a prior report of anything at all that had happened. It was a good thing that he'd actually kept the original copies of the x-rays and the original reports, so he had that as evidence. So all through 2013 and 2014, the nightmares continued, and Terry did his best to record them down in his journals as he had done prior. And then he started to realise that the dreams he was recording were all in chronological order. He looked back for the first time in a long, long time to see what had gone on prior in his journal, and he realised that those memories, he was reliving in chronological order everything that had happened back in 1977 from the first time that the proper abduction had happened. So some of Terry's earliest memories of the abduction started when he was just 8 years old. They were probably going on before that, but these are the first lot that he remembers. And it was causing his parents a lot of grief, because he'd be waking up screaming from nightmares. They weren't sleeping, they were getting agitated. And when your kids are shouting about monkey men and you're not getting any sleep, you don't think monkey men are actually in their bedroom bothering them, do you? It's a case of, you're having a nightmare, go back to sleep. But in Terry's case, this wasn't actually the case. What was happening was he was usually actually awake when the monkey men came into his room. Sometimes he was asleep first, but they'd always wake him up, usually by that creepy feeling that you get when someone's watching you. So normally he'd be sleeping away, happy enough, and then all of a sudden you get that creepy feeling someone's in the room with you, looking at you, and it drags you awake. So the usual scenario would be he'd wake up with this horrible feeling looking around his room, and it would be dark because he got rid of his nightlight when he was 6. So he's a big boy now. He's 8 years old. He doesn't want his nightlight anymore. But he's seeing all these shadows starting to move around his room, and it's scary. He's 8 years old. I mean, it'd be scary for an adult, but to see things moving around in the shadows, getting closer to your bed, and when you actually see them, they're 2 foot tall, grey monkeys with curly tails, all with the same face and the same grin. That's stuff of nightmares, that is. He'd talk to them. They'd come up to him and they'd be saying, "Come play with us, Terry. Come on. We'll take you outside. Come outside and play." And obviously, Terry, being 8 years old, thought monkeys, that could be fun to, good fun to go out and play with. But he was then on the other side of that, it was, well, they're strangers. I shouldn't really go with strangers. And the monkeys would try and coax him. But, if he didn't go with them, then they'd start to turn nasty. And then he'd start worrying, well, what if they're going to take me away? What if, I can never see my family again? Where are they going to take me to? So, he didn't want to go with strangers. But the more time they spent there, the more he realised they weren't strangers. He'd seen them before. He'd been with them before. He didn't remember where they took him, but he remembered he'd been with them before. The longer he made them wait because he was scared, the more irritated they started to get. The more scared he would get because these weren't friendly, smiling monkeys anymore. He knew he was in danger, so he did what any self-respecting 8-year-old would do at that age. He screamed, "Mom! Dad! Mom!" All of a sudden, when the whole light comes on, poof, they're gone. They just vanish into a puff of smoke, just gone. So obviously his parents will come into his room. There's obviously nothing there, but he's awake, and they're saying, "Is it the monkey men again?" Because it's an ongoing saga, the nightmares about the monkey men. What I personally find really interesting about this is the screened memory of it. For him being that age, they've chosen to make themselves look like monkeys to him, to his child's mind. When adults get abducted or taken away, they also have screened memories, but what seems to be a very common replacement is owls. I don't know if anyone's ever seen that film, The Fourth Kind, with the owls in that. That's all. It's aliens. It's just they don't want that memory there. They don't want to be seen that way, so they change the memory because the memory is still there, rather than sometimes they can wipe it, but if they don't wipe it, I don't know why, but they'll just replace themselves with other things. In Terry's case, it was monkeys. In a lot of adults, it's owls. So after Terry's parents came into the room to see what all the screaming was about, his father basically scooped him up and said to him, "What's wrong? Is it the monkeys again?" And his father was kind, but he was justifiably annoyed because this was the 4th time in 2 weeks that he's woken up the whole house screaming about monkeys, about the monkey men. So his dad said to him, "Look, you can sleep in our room tonight, but you're getting a bit too old for this. This hadn't happened since he was 5 years old, and he's 8 now. He himself thinks he's a big boy, and he knows that he shouldn't be doing this. But, he wants to feel safe, so off he goes to bed with his parents. When he wakes up in the morning, his parents are downstairs having a cup of coffee, talking away. When he goes to the bathroom, he can overhear them and he hears the words monkeys being mentioned, so he knows that they're talking about him. So he has a little listen, and basically his father's saying, why monkeys? Out of all the stuff he could be having nightmares about, why monkeys? It just seems so odd. His father was saying that he needs to sleep. They all need to sleep. He said it's not fair that the kids that he's screaming and waking up the other kids as well. They're all starting to struggle and they're all starting to get a little bit short on their tether. And that's making Terry feel bad because he knows this as well. He knows he shouldn't be doing it. So his father says to his mother, see if you can find out what's causing these nightmares and what they're all about. So she says, okay, I'll do my best to do that, and see if we can come up with any ideas on what we can do to make it all stop. So she gives her husband a kiss goodbye and off he goes to work. So Terry then goes down to see his mum, and she kisses the girls and sends them off to school. And she says to Terry, "Can you stay behind? I just want to have a quick chat with you before we go. I'll drive you to school to make sure you're not late." Terry instantly knew what it was already going to be about. So he says, "Oh, I'm sorry, Mum. I didn't mean to wake everyone up. I feel terrible." And she says, "Well, tell me about the dreams. Tell me about these monkeys. Is it all monkeys that you're afraid of? Is it like the monkeys at the zoo, the monkeys on TV?" And he's like, "No, it's only the monkeys from my dream." And she says, "Well, what do they do?" And he says, "Well, they come into my room. They sneak in, and they look friendly at first, and they're all wearing a mask. They're all wearing the same mask," he says. And he's trying to describe this to his mum, but because he's only 8 years old, he's finding it very difficult to convey the whole scenario to her. And he says, they all wear the same mask, and they scare me. They ask me to come and play, and I don't really want to go with them because I'm worried that if I go with them, they'll take me away, and I won't be able to come back. Sometimes I think I've already been out with them. I feel like I have, but I just don't remember." Harry's mum then tries to say to him, "It's a dream. It's just a dream. It's in your head." And Terry's trying to tell her, "No, it's not. I'm awake. It's actually happening." So his mother says, if it's a dream, where do the monkeys go when the whole light comes on?" And Terry says, I don't know. I don't know where they come from. I don't know where they go. But I'm awake." He said, they wake me up. "I know I'm awake." And his mother says, it can feel like you're awake. Dreaming can feel very real that you think you're awake, but it's just a dream." And Terry's just trying to explain to her that it's not, but she just doesn't get it, and she's getting more and more irritated. And she says, "We need to find a way to make this stop. You can't keep waking your sisters up and waking everyone up. Everyone needs to sleep." She said, "Well, maybe how about if we just leave the whole light on for a bit?" Terry was crying at this point, and his mother just said to him, "Look, you just need to trust Mum and Dad, and we'll get it sorted for you." So she took Terry off to school, and he had a normal day in school. And when he came home, his Mum and Dad ushered him into his bedroom and said, "Look, we've got something for you." His father said, I've got a surefire way to stop the monkeys from coming into your room." And he was holding a half-inch strip of weatherproofing. So Terry didn't know what that was. He was like, "What is it?" And his father told him that it's like a special anti-monkey tape that you can put around the windows, which is specifically designed to stop the monkeys getting into his room. Terry was obviously a bit sceptical and said, "What, really? They'll be able to stop the monkeys coming in?" And his dad was like, "Yeah, definitely, it's a sure thing. This is what this is for." So rather than have the effect that should have on Terry, it just made him think to himself, "Oh, well, if they make special tape to stop monkeys coming into bedrooms, then they must be real." So that was even scarier for him. But he went along with his dad's idea of putting the tape up. He knew that somewhere that in his mind the monkeys were only in the zoo or in the jungle, but there was something coming into his room, and if this tape was going to be able to stop it, then he was all for it. Dad said, "You can even sleep with your bedroom light on, which is going to be better than leaving the whole light on." His mother seemed thrilled about the whole tape idea as well. So off they went, they put the tape up, and weirdly, it worked. The monkey dreams, monkey nightmares, monkey visitations stopped. Well, the visitation stopped. He still had a couple of nightmares about the monkeys, but he knew they were nightmares and they weren't the actual real thing. So he was very, very happy with that. So 8 weeks had gone by, nothing. But this only reinforced Terry's thoughts about the monkey men, because the tape worked, which meant they must be real, otherwise the tape wouldn't have worked. And that was the last time Terry ever saw the monkey men. His next experience happened when he was outside on a sunny afternoon. Parents had given him a proper bow and arrow to shoot into the hay, which shows what different time it is, because I wouldn't trust my daughter with a water bomb, never mind a bow and arrow. So as he was trying to notch the arrow into the bow, he noticed a shadow moving along the floor. And he thought, oh, it's just a cloud coming over. Then he realised that the shadow was actually perfectly round. So looking up, he saw a large silver disc-shaped object right above his head. Clearly stunned by the sight, he tried to take in as much detail as he could, but he couldn't identify it. He built model airplanes and helicopters, but this definitely wasn't one of those. So what the hell was it? Could it hurt him? Would it hurt him? This thing was shiny like aluminium, so that ruled out a balloon or a dirigible. Terry was overwhelmed but excited by it, because he said, quite honestly, it looked awesome, like a shiny new sports car. It made no noise, and it wobbled slightly in the breeze. He estimates that it was only around 50 feet above him. Now, the next bit of the story is an absolute hot button for me. This is one of the things that shows up time and time and time again across alien abduction stories. It's the effect of an induced apathy, which basically makes them chill out, calm down, nothing to worry about, nothing's weird here, everything's fine, go back to normal. A lot of people just go back to sleep, go back to bed, have a lay down, and that's exactly what happens here. He feels compelled to relax and lay down, as if nothing was wrong. So he's just laying there looking up at this thing. He marvelled at the highly polished surface. He said the underneath was perfectly flat like a pancake, but the edges curled up slightly. He said that he was really disappointed that he couldn't see the top of it, as he really wanted to see if there was any windows up there, to see if he could see anyone who was flying it. So he continued just looking up, and he notes there were no seams, no rivets, nothing that resembled an exhaust, no markings of any kind. He wondered if wheels came out the bottom, if it wanted to land, or maybe some legs. It must have been built by someone. It was at this point he noticed that everything around him had gone silent. There was no cars driving, there was no birds chirping, he couldn't hear any TVs on the background, he couldn't hear any of the other kids in the street playing. And he also noticed that there was an odd static in the air. He could feel it, all the hairs on his arms sticking up. He said he thought it was like someone had dialed his senses up to 10. He lay there thinking, it's the middle of the afternoon, it's a beautiful day, it's in the middle of a residential neighbourhood. There's got to be loads of people seeing this right now, looking at this big shiny thing that I'm just laying here, staring at. I can't be alone in seeing this. He wasn't sure how long he lay there, just looking up, but he estimated it would be somewhere between 10 minutes and 30 minutes. He said he definitely didn't think it was anything less than 10 minutes, but, it might have been as long as 30. Then, all of a sudden, it gave a little wobble, it angled itself up by about 30 degrees, and it shot off like a bullet. He said it was out of sight in a blink of an eye. As soon as it had vanished out of sight, he called for his mum in a very panicked voice. Obviously his mum had thought he's playing with a bow and arrow, he's either hurt himself or he's shot a neighbour in the head. So out she comes running, and Terry is going ballistic. He thought he'd only screamed once, but apparently he was just screaming constantly because his throat was sore from screaming, and his mother was basically shaking him, trying to make him stop screaming, and she was like, what will the neighbours think? And to be fair, Terry says that was a very real concern, because the neighbours were always looking for the extra next bit of gossip. So for me personally, reading this, the main things that stand out to me on this experience are the induced apathy, which is so common, as I already said. The Oz factor, which is the silence that usually happens around these things, which is everything suddenly goes quiet. You tend to hear a lot on the stories about people when they're in the woods and they have things like Bigfoot encounters or alien abduction encounters in the forest and things like that everything goes quiet, including all the birds and all the animals. But that's something we're going to get into a little bit further in on some of the next lot of podcasts. It's just all the similarities that you tend to see that actually crop up, which in my opinion add a little bit of validity to these experiences. Because if I was going to make something up, really make something up, it would be nuts. I wouldn't be doing the same as everyone else is doing. I'd go as far out as I possibly could. But it's the little things that always crop up that you see between the people who do seem genuine, and that is the telepathic control, if you like, or the apathy that comes with things like this. It's what we call the Oz factor, or the Oz effect of the silence. The other thing that you hear and see a lot with the UFO subject is how fast they accelerate. And if you had a human or something like that on a ship, you just get turned to mulch because the G-force would just splat you against the side of a ship. We are going to dig into this a bit further in some of the next podcasts, but with a lot of the more recent and up-to-date stuff, like the Commander Fravor videos and stuff like that, with the gimbal footage when they're being chased by the Super Hornets, just how fast and agile these things actually are. And it begs to differ the question, if there's no sonic booms, which is one of the other things that gets regularly recorded, is are they actually moving in phase? Are they subject to the physical laws that we are? Because it doesn't look like it. It doesn't look like they move like a space, like an airplane could, or a helicopter, or anything like that. These things are bouncing around like ping pong balls. They're vibrating, they're shaking, they're moving far too quickly. But yeah, we'll come back to that, because to me this is part of the really interesting part of the subject is, what are they capable of, what are the physics behind them? Mind-blowing. Anyway, back to the story as I digress. So Terry's mum managed to usher him back inside the house, and Terry was like, well, what was it? Did you see it? What on earth was it? He's thinking, mum's a grown-up, she's bound to know what it is. He asked, do you think it was like a flying saucer? And his mum sat him down at the table and said, come on, Terry, it was probably a jet or something like that. I don't know what you saw, but it definitely was not a flying saucer. Terry'd seen flying saucers on things like The Outer Limits, or he'd seen them on comic books or other TV shows, and it sure as hell looked like a flying saucer to him. After all, his mother didn't see it. She didn't know what he'd seen, so she couldn't really comment on that sensibly. But, that's what Terry thought anyway. Next thing, his sisters come downstairs, and of course, being siblings, the first thing they want to do is, take the mick. So they said, what's going on? And Terry's mum said, Terry thinks he's seen a flying saucer, and now he's throwing a fit. So obviously his sisters start ribbing him, and she's like, did the monkey men fly it? Are the monkey men here again? Are they come to take you away on their flying saucer? Now, don't you tease him, Terry's mum told the girls, but it was too late. Damage was done, they already knew, and they were just going to rib him for it. Terry's mum gave the girls all the details, so now they had all the ammunition they needed to make his life hell for weeks. Unfortunately for Terry, it didn't stop there either. So his mum was getting more and more upset, because Terry was getting more and more upset. As you can imagine, he was convinced of what he saw. Nobody believed him. His mother sat him down and tried to get him to draw a picture of what he'd actually seen, but it was almost impossible for him to draw. All he could draw was like a circle. He was 8 years old, and he thought, I'm a pretty decent drawer, but how do I do something like this? And so all he could come up with a circle. So his mum then decided to start phoning the neighbours to see if they'd seen anything. And they were obviously like, no, we didn't see anything at all. Why'd you ask? And then she told them, Terry thinks he saw a spaceship, and now he's throwing a fit. So obviously they then told their kids, and the whole neighbourhood knew about it. And by 6 o'clock that evening, the whole street knew, and the other kids were straight onto him, and they started bullying him over it. Terry's one saving grace was that the summer holidays were just around the corner, and he was hoping that they'd all forget about it and move on, because they were all going to have other stuff to do. That evening, when Terry's father got home, his mother intercepted him as soon as he walked through the front door, and Terry felt bad for his father. His father was exhausted and said, unless someone's died, can it just wait until I've had a bath? Because he just wanted a bath and a hot meal, and his wife was straight into him. Understandably so. Off they went to the bedroom to talk, and so Terry was waiting outside. He could hear muffled voices, and then when his father came out, he said, come with me, and promptly led him into Terry's bedroom to sit him down. Worn out after a long day, his father said, well, son, what's all this nonsense I hear about you and flying saucers? No, Dad, he replied. It was just the one flying saucer. Terry then tried to convey to him exactly what had happened, but his father was just getting more and more irritated by what Terry was saying, and the more Terry tried to convince him, the faster he talked, the more irritated his father got. He could see he was starting to lose his temper. His father said to him, come on now, son, we've already discussed all this, remember? About the monkeys? This isn't real. Terry obviously had that logic bomb up his sleeve and said to his dad, "But Dad, if the monkey men weren't real, how did you have special tape to keep the monkey men out? How come it worked? You wouldn't need magic tape if they were just dreams." His dad wasn't ready for that, and Terry was surprised that his father actually kept his composure. Terry knew that his dad had lied to him about the monkey tape because he'd actually gone into the garage and found the bag and seen that it said weather stripping on it, so he already knew his father had lied to him about it. His father then said, "You know, Terry," he said, "the reason the weather stripping worked was because you believed it would work." He said, "We've already had the conversation. There's no such thing as ghosts, monkey men, UFOs. You know this. None of it's real. The reason that tape worked because you believed it would work. All this is in your head. Remember we discussed, Godzilla is that man in a costume stomping on little toy cars and toy buildings making weird sounds. Everything in the sky, like Sputnik and all the other stuff, it comes from here. Everything's man-made. None of this stuff is real." Terry, his dad, said, "You can't go round the neighbourhood telling people that you've seen flying saucers. They're going to think something's wrong with you. They're going to think something's wrong with us as a family. You just can't do it. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," he said. "Now, what you probably saw was a shiny jet, okay? Now, I want you to say it with me. What you saw was a shiny jet. Now, what is it that you thought you saw?" Terry did the unthinkable, and he lied. And he said, "Well, I guess it could have been a shiny jet." "There we go, son," his dad said. "Now, we can put all this nonsense to bed. Let's go and have some dinner." Terry knew it wasn't worth pursuing any further, or else he would just end up getting shouted at by his father, so he let it lie. He put it to bed, but he knew what he saw. He knew it wasn't a jet. And a couple of weeks later, it started to manifest. He started having severe nightmares. They all began all over again. It wasn't monkeys this time. It was people coming into his room, shadows coming into his room and taking him away. And he remembers that they were holding him down, and some giant bug thing started operating on him. A giant 6-foot tall mantis being. Now, I'm just going to take a break for the story for a second here and just jump into that. So, usually with these abduction stories, you tend to hear there's only a bunch of the same old faces that seem to be doing the rounds, and mantis beings are up there. As weird as it sounds, obviously you got the traditional greys, but also what you tend to find in the stories is you have the small little greys, then you have a tall grey who seems to be in charge, or a praying mantis sort of being that is either in charge or is carrying out the operation. So yeah, I just wanted to interject that here because I know it sounds bonkers, giant praying mantis beings, but you'd be stunned how often these guys actually pop up in these stories. So anyway, back to Terry's nightmare. Terry's nightmares were completely involved around the actual abduction aspect of it, and also the operation side of things. I mean, chances are, as we know, these probably aren't nightmares, but his parents were convincing and telling him that they were. The other thing that they thought was that he was having nightmares about UFOs, but he was trying to explain it's not. It's nothing to do with UFOs. It's the beings. He doesn't have nightmares about UFOs. But they were convinced because all this started after he had that UFO sighting that it was all that he was having nightmares about UFOs. In reality, though, Terry thought the UFO that he saw was absolutely fantastic. He loved it. It didn't hurt him, it didn't harm him in any way. He thought it was a spectacular experience. He wasn't linking it to the awful abduction nightmares and things that he was actually having. He would fantasize about, speaking to the alien visitors on board that spacecraft. Maybe you could have gone to Washington as their ambassador, to discuss technologies and all this wonderful stuff. So for him, it was nothing actually to do with UFOs. The teasing from his classmates over the subject stopped after about a week. All of his friends, everything went back to normal. They found new victims for their torment, as kids do, get bored very quickly. His sisters, on the other hand, that was a completely different story. They made his life hell with it. They were constantly hiding and then jumping out on him and pretending to be like mechanical robots. Must get Terry, must get Terry. And the poor bugger, he was 8 years old. He dealt with bullying as best as he could, but his sisters were really starting to upset him and get to him. By this point, Terry'd had enough, and he decided that enough was enough, and he was going to retaliate. So what he did was he planned his revenge. He snuck underneath the sofa and waited. He waited for over an hour for his older sister, Judy, to come in, and she sits down on the sofa, and what she'd do is, during the evening, she'd sit on the phone, and she'd phone her friend, and she'd be chatting with her friends on the phone until his father would come in and kick her out there so he could have the TV. So anyway, he's under the sofa, and Judy comes in, and she sits down, and she breaks out her princess phone, and she's there, and next she's been on the phone for a while, and she's completely engrossed in the conversation, which is what Terry's waiting for. And then he slowly reaches out and grabs both her ankles at the same time, and then yells loud enough to wake the dead and scares the life out of her. She's so scared, she actually wets herself, she screams, she runs out of the room, and she is in bits. Not only did she wet her pants, but she wet the sofa. She ran to the bathroom. Terry ran to his bedroom. This obviously got his father involved, and his father was fuming. He sat Terry down and said to him, "What gives you the right to scare your sister that bad that she wets herself?" Now, historically, Terry said at this point he would normally have, bowed down and said, "Oh, I'm really sorry, it won't happen again." But he'd had enough. He said no. He said, "Because I wanted them to know what it's like to be as scared as I am. I'm fed up of them jumping out and scaring me all the time." He said, if they don't want more of the same, you need to make them stop doing it." His father was shocked. He'd never heard Terry, speak up like this, and he totally understood it as well. Terry carried on because he was on a roll. He said, "Spank me if you want, but," he said, "you need to make them stop. I'm not taking this anymore." Terry flat out refused to back down. He stared his father, and he knew this wasn't a father-son conversation. This was a conversation between two adults. He'd put his foot down, and he was standing up for himself. Terry sadly notes at this point that his relationship with his father after this was never a close one. The trust had been broken between him and his father when his father lied to him about the monkey tape. Terry always believed the truth was an important thing, and he just felt he couldn't trust his father any longer because of the lying about the monkey tape, about the fact that he was making him lie about what he saw. And it affects him. Imagine how you'd feel if you knew something absolutely was real and that you'd seen it with your own eyes, and everyone else, especially your parents, were telling you didn't see it, you're wrong, it's all in your head, you're making it up. That's not gonna do much for your trust issues. Terry's father spoke to his sisters after the incident, and that thankfully they never ever bothered Terry with it ever again. He obviously told them how serious it was, and they had to stop, and it got taken on board. Terry notes that from the nightmares stemmed some other issues, like he started developing a fear of going outside, of being alone outside after dark. As soon as the street lights would come on, he'd run home. He needed to get back inside. Another odd thing that happened, which does get explained later on in the book, is that there's a little Asian lady who lives next door who's always been very, very kind to them, which Terry always used to really like. And suddenly he's developed a fear of her. He won't go anywhere near her. He's psychologically damaged after all the trauma that he's been through, and his parents just don't really know how to deal with it. Terry started dreading nighttime. He was struggling to sleep, or if he did, he'd always wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning. All his grades in school started slipping, probably because he wasn't sleeping. His parents, as I said, they were at a loss of what to do, so they decided to take him to the doctors. As far as Terry was concerned, his whole belief system had changed since he'd seen that UFO, because what he now knew was that grown-ups don't know everything. They don't always tell the truth, and they couldn't be trusted because he knew what he'd seen, and they just wouldn't believe him, and that hurt the most. These are his parents, and they just wouldn't believe him. And I can understand, as a parent, that if your child is having flights of fancy, I suppose I'm a bit more open-minded than most because I'm into all this sort of stuff. But, you can totally appreciate, and especially back in that era as well, that would have been, it's a no-nonsense sort of time. So, anyway, his father takes Terry over to the doctors. His father wanted an end put to all of this, as he referred to it, UFO bullshit that was interfering with him being able to get a good night's sleep, interfering with the family harmony, and basically just wanted everything back how it was, Bear in mind, this was back in 1963. It was a different time. The doctors are going to be no nonsense. So when his father takes him to the doctors, as you can quite imagine how this is going to go, his father thought it would be something the doctor could just fix, like it was chicken pox, maybe give him a tablet and it'll all go away. But clearly, an intense trauma like this isn't going to be fixed by anyone. And after Terry's distrust of his father and adults in general for lying, you can't blame the poor bugger for being a bit reluctant to actually tell the doctor anything when he gets there. Now, Terry's never had a problem with the doctor before. It's never bothered him, but when he got there, seeing them in their white lab coats set something off in him as well, and it was just, he had suddenly had a newfound fear of the doctor. He'd never had a problem with the room in there before, but all of a sudden he was in there and he started to feel very anxious looking at the metal table, the big overhead light. It started making him feel very apprehensive. The doctor could see this in him and said, "Oh, don't worry, there's no shot for you today, it's just a normal examination and checking over." So the doctor then proceeded through the usual sort of stick out your tongue, pushed on his abdomen, all this sort of stuff. Terry knew, though, that there wasn't actually any exam really going on. He knew exactly what it was going to be leading up to. And then the doctor said to him, "So, Terry, your father says you saw something out in the back garden. You want to tell me what you think it was?" "What do you mean?" Terry said, plain dumb. "Your father says that you saw something flying or hovering out in the back garden and it has been giving you nightmares." Terry said, "Well, I've been having nightmares, but it's not about what was flying in the garden." "That was just a jet," Terry said. The doctor said, "Come on now, why would a jet give you nightmares about spaceships?" "I'm not having nightmares about spaceships," replied Terry. "It just gave me bad dreams. I don't know why." "Come on, son," the doctor said as sincerely as he possibly could. "You can tell me. Just tell me all about it. Tell me about what you saw and why it's giving you bad dreams." "It was a jet," Terry replied. "Now, why would a jet give you bad dreams?" said the doctor. "I don't know," replied Terry. "It just did." Terry started tearing up a bit. He was livid. He knew exactly where this was going, that no one was going to believe him, especially not the doctor. "I guess it could have been a jet," said Terry. "Ah, now we're getting somewhere," said the doctor, happy with that answer. He said, "Look, what we're going to do, I'm going to ask your father to leave the room, and then I want you to tell me all about it. I'm your doctor, boy. You can trust me. You need to talk to me man to man and tell me exactly what happened." Terry thought about it for a minute. He really wanted to get it off his chest. He really wanted someone to talk to, someone to believe him. So then it all just came out. He told the doctor absolutely everything. The doctor nodded in all the right places, and he just took everything on board what Terry said. Once Terry had finished telling him in his story, the doctor called his father back in, and the doctor just said to his father, "What sort of TV are you letting this boy watch?" His father and the doctor had a discussion as if Terry wasn't even in the room. And the doctor basically just said, "Your son's got an overactive imagination. It's made worse by things like Johnny Quest and Space Ghost and all these other TV shows." So the doctor recommended that he stop watching any of that crap on TV. He then turned his attention back to Terry and said to him, "Boy, when you're 8 years old..." "I'm 9, corrected Terry. "When you're 9 years old," the doctor said, "your imagination can run wild with you. I'm sure you think you saw a UFO or a flying saucer, whatever you want to call it, but we both know those things aren't real. Don't we, Terry?" Terry wanted to hit him. He was livid. But in a quiet, resigned voice, he just said, "Yes, sir." The doctor looked at Terry's father for confirmation. "So you see, Terry, these things are all in your head. None of it's real. Now you know that, don't you?" Terry, even though he was only 9 years old, knew a leading question when he saw one. and he was just seething inside. But he was resigned. He knew they weren't going to believe him, so he just, yes, sir. The doctor then pulled a chair up and sat next to Terry and urged his father to do the same. Then the doctor's demeanour changed and said in a very stern voice, "Now, boy, repeat after me. There is nothing in the sky that can hurt me. Flying saucers are not real. Now, say it loud in a clear voice." Terry repeated, "There is nothing in the sky that can hurt me, and there's no such thing as flying saucers." And that was as far as Terry got. He welled up. He didn't cry, but he just knew that 9-year-old boys have no power in a situation like this. There was literally nothing he could do. The doctor continued on. "You know, you should just stop watching all these programs on TV, or better yet, get outside, play some ball, ride your bike." Yeah, thought Terry, I've heard all this crap before. Then the doctor turned to Terry's father and said, "Yep, I think that's done it. I don't think there'll be any more nightmares, maybe 1 or 2, but I think that's done it." The doctor then shook hands with Terry's father, gave them both a smile, and then they set off back to the car. Of course, there was a stop on the way home for some ice cream, and it turns out Rocky Road is the price of a 9-year-old's dignity. The coming weeks brought lots of Larry, Curly and Moe. His TV privileges were heavily reduced down to things like slapstick comedy and nothing alien related or anything science fiction. That only lasted for a few weeks because obviously watching the same TV show did everybody's head in the household, so that didn't last for very long. The nightmares continued for about a year, maybe a year and a bit, but after that they all wound down. Now this is where we're going to be finishing the end of today's podcast on the incident at Devil's Den, but I assure you that's not the end of it at all. This is literally just the end of his experiences that he recalls when he was younger. On the next episode we're going into the proper story where he gets full on abducted by aliens, he gets grilled by the government, and it's an incredible story. I really urge you guys to go and pick up this book, or at least listen to it on Audible. It's just so good. Once again, thanks for listening to the very first episode of Are They Real? And it would be great if anybody out there has got any experiences or any stories they'd like to share. If you can email me in on R, as in the letter R, _theyreal@outlook.com. So that's R_theyreal@outlook.com. And I would love to read some of those stories out in further podcasts. But as of next week, we're going to be finishing off the incident at Devil's Den, and I can't wait to see what you guys think of that. So until then, stay safe and have a great week.